Welcome to Instant Deck Techs. The aim of this series is to give you a short, concise guide on how to build a certain deck. It won't cover every card, but we'll go through all the categories and go over the types of cards needed to make the deck work. Any card mentioned will be down in the description below. The commander of this deck is Lier, Disciple of the Drowned. It is 3 blue for a 3/4 legendary creature human wizard. It has Spells Can't Be Countered, and each instant and sorcery in your graveyard has flashback. The flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. This is going to be a graveyard-based SPELLSLINGER deck. About 60% of the non-land cards in the deck, so about 35 to 40 cards, I'd want to be instants and sorceries. This means that our graveyard becomes an extension of our hand, as most of the spells will get flashback from Lier. Being able to cast most of our deck twice is really powerful, and will mean that you'll always have something to do. Like most symmetrical effects in Commander, we can also run cards that work around Lier's ability that means spells can't be countered, to fully make the most of it. Let's start with our card draw. I personally would want to run a lot of it in this deck. One of the ways this deck wins is by casting lots of instants and sorceries, so having this on cheap card draw lets you cast spells over and over again. First up is cards that draw you cards while also putting them in the graveyard. Again, in this deck, most of what we mill we can flashback with our commander anyway, so it's all upside. I'd really try to keep the mana cost of these spells down, only going up in mana for powerful effects like Windfall and Fact or Fiction. But blue doesn't stop there with its cheap card draw, and while these don't add extra cards to the graveyard, there's still only 1 mana spells that we can cast and flashback in the same turn to trigger some of our other effects. Some other things to look out for in this section is cards like Frantic Search, which untap lands, cards with Delve like Dig Through Time, which would be good at using up some of the permanents we've milled into the bin, and then some big draw X spells are a nice way of dumping some mana late game. In terms of permanents that draw us cards, I really don't think you need too many. Secrets of the Dead is nice as it draws us a card whenever we flashback a spell, which hopefully will be quite a bit. Archmage Emeritus, on the other hand, doing it when we cast an instant or sorcery from our hand, and then when we flash it back, is going to be really strong, and will draw us a ton of cards if it sticks on the board for any amount of time. As this deck is going to want a lot of blue mana to work, we need to make sure our ramp package is suited to match that. First up is cards that get islands out of our deck. Islands is really where we want our mana to be coming from. As we're a mono blue deck, however, we don't have too many options, so I'd run as many that you have available to you. After these is rocks that tap for blue. You can run things like Soul Ring and more traditional fast mana, and they'll help you get your commander out nice and early, but they don't really help you when it comes to casting things like Ponder or Preordain. When you build your deck, if your curve is low, stick with these as they'll be good for tapping for blue mana. If your curve is high, with a lot of 3 and 4 drops, then dust off the old Soul Ring and Worn Power Stone. The only ramp that adds colourless I would be tempted by is cards like Deranged Assistant and Millikin, as these also help out our game plan by putting cards into the graveyard, so effectively they're ramp and card draw. Moving over to our interaction, we can actually run quite a bit of it in this deck if it's in the form of instants and sorceries. With Lier, regular counterspells don't work, but we will have some ways around that as well. First up is cheap spells that destroy or exile a threat and leave something behind. This is classic blue removal, and while not great in most other formats, it excels in Commander where the threats it's removing are normally bigger than what's left behind. And while we can't counter spells with Lier out, we can exile them or return them to their controller's hands, with cards like these. These are generally more expensive than regular counterspells, but they break the symmetry of our commander while giving us the ability to interact with our opponent's spells. We do still have the opportunity to play some counter magic, we're still a mono blue deck after all. There will be times where Lier isn't on the board, in which case we can counter away to our heart's content. When Lier is out, however, having cards that have additional effects on them means they will never just be dead cards in our hand or in our graveyard. We'll still be able to cast them and get value from them. So, as we've said, we can't save Lier with counter magic, and because he's quite an integral piece to our game plan, we'll need to run some extra ways of protecting him. Starting with the very traditional Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots. They're a classic for a reason, and will be very solid in this deck at keeping Lier around that little bit longer. Another way of protecting him from targeted removal is with something like Spellskite, which is pretty damn good at eating up a Doomblade. After that, we can run some spells that give a creature hexproof for a turn, or change the target of a spell away from our board. The fact you can cast these as well from the graveyard makes them much better, as they go from a 1-time use spell to a 2-times use spell. Moving on to our SPELLSLINGER package. This is where most of our non-instants and sorceries that the deck will be running will be. The aim of this package is to either help us cast our instants and sorceries, or to give us value when we do cast them. First up is cards that make our instants and sorceries cheaper. If your mana curve is low, you won't need to run as many of these. The higher it gets, then the better these get. What we're really after is to bring down the cost of our instants and sorceries to just a single blue. I've also not included these in the ramp, as most of them don't help you cast your other spells, so they should be run as well as ramp and not instead of. The next part of the SPELLSLINGER package is cards that makes tokens when we cast instants and sorceries. This is how we generate a board state so we can attack and block ourselves. Of all of the permanents in the deck, these are probably the most important, and are made even better when combined with the cheap spells we've already gone over. Being able to cast a cheap spell, make a token, and then recast it from a graveyard to make another token will be really good, and having multiple of them out escalates very quickly. Another card that works really well with all the cheap card draw in the deck is Psychosis Crawler. Being able to hit all our opponents every time we draw a card will really add up in this deck. And then another great way of throwing some damage around is with Sentinel Tower and Aetherflux Reservoir. If your opponents don't deal with these, then they'll soon be on the end of a laser to the face. Or in the case with Sentinel Tower, maybe even mowing down their whole board of creatures. These cards are practically win conditions. Talking of win conditions, let's go over some dedicated ways of winning the game. First up is the more stormy side of things, with the package of High Tide, Turnabout, Brain Freeze, and Mind's Desire. Being able to cast High Tide twice in a big turn, and making all our islands tap for 3 mana, is some serious ramping. When combined with casting Turnabout, makes it insane. You can then cast any cantrips from your hand or graveyard, raising the storm count nice and high. Brain Freeze can either then be used to mail out an opponent, or us, to put even more cards into our graveyard which we can then continue to cast. Mind's Desire can then be used as a top end to hit some really big mana spells in the deck. In terms of those big top end cards, we can look at running some extra turn spells. These might not be everyone's cup of tea, and personally I'm not a fan if they're just used to extend the game out. But in this deck, where we can use them aggressively to make a board state on one turn, and then take an extra turn, and then use that board state to attack, I do like them. Another card that I'm not the biggest fan of when used to draw out a game is Cyclonic Rift. However, again, when used as a win condition, to clear out our opponent's boards so ours can swing through straight away, that works very well. One last spell that really goes great with all these big effects is Mnemonic Deluge. Getting any big spell 3 times from a graveyard will be backbreaking for our opponents, and hopefully will win the game for us. I really like having a big splashy Haymaker card in a commander deck, and this does the job very nicely. Moving over to our utility lands, we can run a decent number as we are a mono-coloured deck, but we don't want to run too many non-islands at the same time, as they won't count towards High Tide. I think around 8 is a decent place to start. When looking for utility cards, look for things that help with what the deck is trying to do, or provide some effects that we might be lacking. I quite like Riptide Laboratory in this deck, as it can bounce our commander to our hand in a pinch if we don't have any ways of protecting it, or it even lets us bounce it so we can then play a counterspell that the whole table won't see coming. I also like Terrain Generator as an extra way of getting more islands into play. The rest of your mana base will be very dependent on what you have available to you. We recently released a video with some advice on building a deck with a budget mana base, which might be of help. Until next time, please like, share and subscribe, and let us know down in the comments if there are any commanders you'd like to see a deck tech on. Thank you very much for watching.